I was drawn to this script because primarily the participation of Kira was a big draw for me. And also I met with Matt Ruskin, who I had seen Crown Heights, which is a really complex examination of the criminal justice system and a very deeply moral film. And it was very obvious to me that Matt was trying to tell this story for the right reasons. He really was invested in exposing the fact that these women were behind the coordination of the police department in Boston in a way that had never been done before. They really put themselves in a vulnerable position by criticizing the police department, and at a time when there were very few female journalists and almost none of them doing this kind of work. They were on the advice desk in the lifestyle columns, doing some stunt reporting for, they'd go to a county fair, but they weren't covering crime. And what fortitude was required for these women to pursue this case. I mean, that's a really extraordinary story. And as far as what I knew about the case, I knew what everybody else knew. The story of the psychopath DeSalvo who murdered all these women and the Tony Curtis film. I had no idea that these women were a really integral part of the story and exposing not only DeSalvo, but again, the complications of the case and the possibility there were multiple killers, and possibly some men taking advantage of the Stranglers' modus operandi to murder their mistresses, and just the way that that opportunists will find a way to exploit any opportunity to get rid of their problems easier. So there were just a lot of things about it I didn't know, and I really loved Matt, and I so enjoyed working with Kira, and it was a really marvelous process. What was surprising to me about Jean's story, of course, she's operating in this male-dominated arena, but she also came from a time when her father had an eighth grade education, fourth grade education. Her mother had an eighth grade education. He was a firefighter, and she worked for the telephone company. And Jean was one of the first people in her family to go on to have a career of this magnitude. Her brother actually was a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer. So clearly it was a family that valued education. And what I loved about Jean's story is that she was working at a Pinkham's drugstore after high school. She had one more class to take before going to nursing school. And there was a disappearance of a young girl in the town. And Bob Court was one of the journalists covering the story because that was where the public telephone was. So all the journalists were reporting back to their offices from the Pinkham's drugstore. And she said, "Hey, you got a job for me?" And he called her in actually to have a meeting that August with the editor. And she ended up starting off as a copy boy. And she worked her way up. And I just find that extraordinary. As a practical feminist, just knowing she had to put her head down and do her work. She still had to be feminine. She still had to make dinner. She had to write her stories at 2 a.m. at the dining room table. And as Kira pointed out, all the while being threatened. I mean, they were threatened for anything, not just covering, if women covered politics, they were threatened. It's not just covering a serial killer. So really an extraordinary obstacle. She was up against a lot. And the fact that these women continued to go on to have these really amazing careers, still in a time where there were so few female journalists working. Jean ended up covering crime for the rest of her career. Loretta was an award-winning medical journalist. They were loved and admired by their families for what they overcame, and it was a real honor to get to tell that story.